Hello. So this is going to be my Module 4 Reflection Journal. So the first question is describe the top 3 things you discovered about historical, social, cultural trauma and its impact on African Americans. I think for number 1, I really took away the impact that trauma can have on you, whether you lived through it or not. And we're going to get more into this, but just the fact that it can lead to greater health problems down the road, and that this trauma and the history in our country has led to these problems still impacting African Americans today. And so with that, segregation, I think, is a huge thing that is still impacting African Americans today. We know about segregation. We know how big of a deal it is. We know it still exists. But hearing and reading that African Americans are the most residentially segregated racial group in the country was kind of wild to me. And we know that, we hear about it, but I just thought that was a big deal, as well as the home ownership rates. And so what I liked in the textbook was it says, yeah, we're making progress. The African American home ownership rate has grown to 49%, but it's still way behind white people, which is 76%. So I thought that was kind of crazy. And then also with that, the suburbs and transportation policies have really focused on highways to connect people from the suburbs into metropolitan areas instead of focusing on transportation in metropolitan areas. And this is something living in Midtown Kansas City that I notice all the time. We don't have good public transportation. We don't have even a decent bus system. We have it, but it's not great and it's not accessible. I was doing some research outside of the readings this week too, and read that in Kansas City, in the city, over half of residents in Kansas City take a 2-hour round trip bus ride to the grocery store and back. So just thinking about having to carry your groceries that far to the bus stop or to ride the bus that long just to the grocery store, and then you can't carry that much back with you, and having to do that 2-hour trip every week. If you have kids, a job, it's just insanity. And that's simply just to get some basic groceries. And with the segregation, obviously that affects the access to schools, jobs, health, economic well-being, upward mobility. I thought the upward mobility section was super interesting. And then that just leads people to having to get illegal jobs, creates unsafe neighborhoods, and really keeps people in poverty. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about that is impacting African Americans still from historical, social, cultural trauma is the health racism, access to health care. People of color are more likely to live in neighborhoods that are noisy, close to highways, have air pollution, are close to toxic chemical plants, or neighborhoods that could be exposed to things that cause cancer or other diseases. And also, in addition to that, they are receiving worse health services, lower insurance, less access to health services, more stigma around mental health, less access to mental health services, and even a stigma around trying to get care, maybe being seen as more med-seeking or not taking pain seriously if it is from an African American client or patient, things like that. So the second question is, how is historical intergenerational trauma different from individualized trauma? And I really think the big thing here is just that it's shared by a group of people. And so it is not an individual trauma. It's not a trauma that happened to one person. It happened to a group of people. And this can span multiple generations. And what I thought was so interesting is that people can experience these trauma-related symptoms without actually being present for the traumatic event, which makes sense, especially when you see someone who looks like you being assaulted by an officer or being screamed at by a racist, whatever it may be. That can be very triggering. And so these big historical events can still impact people today. And this is often passed down through narratives, through talking about it. And so sometimes that can get skewed depending on who is giving the information. And so the third question, based on the module material, describe the impact of the dominant systemic standards and values of white supremacy on the African American lived experience. So something that I've learned over time and that I have kind of took out of these videos and this information was that this country was built on white supremacy. It was built on this caste system that sees white people as the dominant race, and so then everybody else is supposed to follow the norm. And we can really dictate, we as in white people, I guess, can really dictate the cultural norms. And also talking about how the majority group often dictates conversation around a race and decides what is shared and how. I mean, we write the history books. We decide how kids learn about racism. And that is really something that we've got to change in this country. And really that just people of color, because of the history, because of the past traumas, just start at a different starting line than people who are born white, especially those who are born into the middle class or upper class and are also white. This leads to, a difference in the neighborhood you live in even inheritance or money or assets that you were left with, and then access to healthcare, and all of the other things we've talked about. And that is simply because of the color of skin you were born in. So I thought the readings this week and everything was super interesting, and I am excited to continue to learn about this.